both for joining the conversation today evening. It's a Friday evening, and I'm glad that we could have so many people join us in. And also, of course, we are marking 16 days of activism. So this conversation comes at an opportune time for all of us who are engaged in economics, in public policy, and shaping the agenda on women's work and economic empowerment. And so I'm very excited to have this conversation. So let me just start off, Dr. Viswanath. And I know most of these conversations sort of trace back the speaker's sort of journey professionally and personally, and what inspired them to enter the field that they're pursuing. So, perhaps making you jog back your memory a little to just tell us a little more about what inspired you to, of course, pursue sociology and then enter the space on feminist women's movement and women's rights, and of course, eventually to co-found Safetipin. So over to you, Dr. Viswanath, to answer that.
Hi, good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. Thanks to WIEP, and nice to meet you all. So, Kanika, that's an interesting question, and I think if I look back, I think feminism and issues of women's rights is something that has always been important to me. And I look at the books I read when I was very young, and that's how I figured out as I grew older that probably this predilection towards feminism started very early. So I did my master's and finally my PhD in sociology, because sociology was a discipline that allowed me to interrogate social norms, cultural norms, and place them within a context. And actually, my PhD thesis was on the contemporary women's movement in India, what we call the third wave, so to say, which begins in the 1970s. So actually, I managed to bring together my two passions, which was really doing research as well as the women's movement. And I I was in Delhi, I was at the Delhi School of Economics, and I went to Jagori, which is a very well-known women's organization at that time, in 1990. And I met with some of the, really the founding mothers of the movement, who are now, some of them no longer with us, including Kamla Basin and Gauri Chowdhury and other really powerful women, very inspiring. And at that time, actually my first sort of feminist protest was in 1990, where it was a protest against communalism. If you remember, late 1980s, there was the Shah Banu case, there was the Roop Kanwar Sati case. So there was there was a beginning of communalism, and very soon, in a year later, was the Babri Masjid demolition. So I think we had begun to recognize, women's movements, that communalism was an issue that was something that was going to become big within social movements. And this was in India Gate in Delhi, if any of you know Delhi or remember Delhi. In those days, India Gate was, you could actually drive in all the way to the center on each of the radials. It was not just a circular road. So at the heart of India Gate, at the center, there was a protest where women were sort of holding saris with messages on peace and nonviolence. And that was my first introduction to feminist activism in Delhi. And really, after that, I was completely hooked. And I realized that, as feminists, if we need to make a point, it's not enough to write about it. We need to be on the streets. We need to listen to women's voices. And so that was my sort of, my introduction into activism. And the trial by fire came a year later, when the Babri Masjid came down, and it was a very political moment. Then there was the Bhamri Devi case, when the first time on issues of sexual harassment at the workplace, rape. So it was a heady moment. It was also the time that the early activism around LGBTQ rights came up. And so the 90s was really my time of activism. I also managed to finish a PhD somehow through that period. And when I finished my PhD, I realized that I didn't want to enter the academic space, a pure academic space. I wanted to do research. I wanted to be a practitioner. And so I actually joined Jagori for a few years, and I was a director for till about 2007 with a brief break in between. And so I sort of did activism. We did very interesting research on that time around single women, around women workers, around migration, and on the issue of safe city. And it was really in that period that the issue of safe cities for women, as looking at safe public spaces, came into the feminist discourse, because there was work on, violence in the home, domestic violence, rape, violence in the workplace, but we hadn't looked at public spaces as a site of violence, as a site of where women were facing lack of opportunities. So we did some early safety audits in Jagori. We worked with the Delhi government. We actually took this around to many cities in India, worked with the UN Habitat, UN Women, and it really sort of took off. I think it was a very powerful kind of set of tools that we came up with, where women were then seen as the experts of their lived experience in a city, in order to find solutions, rather than top-down solutions, rather than complicated surveys. This was a simple tool where women could audit, women could look at their own lives, everyday lives in a city, and say what is it they wanted improved. And in 2013, taking this tool of the safety audit, my co-founder and I decided to build an app around it, because it was at a time that apps were becoming popular. We thought it was a way of getting it out of just an NGO space and say it could be accessible to anyone who had a smartphone. And so that was really what drove us then. Honestly, I wasn't planning to start a tech or data company. It just sort of, it was quite serendipitous. We just did this app. We thought we'd put it out there and get back to what we were doing. But it really got traction. We got support from people to build it, to test it, to take it forward. We had some super partnerships with the UK Aid, with Hindustan Times. We had Nandita Das come and launch the app. So it sort of took a life of its own. And yeah, and when something then takes off, you sort of, I mean, I've always sort of felt a bit that, it's, I'm happy to sort of take the journey that life is showing me. I'm not one of those people who has this plan. I never had a plan, not at 20, not at 40, not at 50. So I was willing to move with the flow, which seemed to want to take Safetipin and grow it, innovate with it, take it to different places. And so, yeah, that's sort of been my journey to where I am right now.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Viswanath. I think that's also very inspiring for a lot of us to hear where sort of that journey starts and where it takes you. And equally keen to understand a bit more about how Safetipin works. I know a lot of us who work in the space perhaps know, about the app and the safety audits, but for some of our listeners who've joined in, if you can talk a bit about what Safetipin is, how does it work, and this whole idea of sort of crowdsourcing some of that data, I think it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Certainly. So Safetipin is a set of technology tools, of which one is an app called My Safetipin. And Safetipin is spelled as SAFETIPIN, simply because we wanted a .com address at that point. But the Safetipin, the genesis of the name actually is also quite interesting. It was because if you look at our app, we have pins on where places are safe or unsafe. So it was really pinning safety, which was one of the reasons. But the second reason, which is a little more interesting, is many women of my generation, when we rode buses, we actually carried a physical safety pin to keep us safe from people who are getting too close to us. So it has a resonance with a lot of people. And interestingly, in many other countries, also, I found it had a resonance, in Egypt and in some countries of Latin America, people actually understood the safety pin actually as a as a little tool of safety. So we sort of looked at ourselves as a digital safety pin for women to find safety for themselves. So what does my safety pin do? So as I said, the core of it is something called a safety audit. A safety audit is a set of parameters through which you measure the level of safety, that you feel in a public space. And I do want to emphasize this issue of you feel, because we look at the perception of safety, because the perception of safety is actually what drives behavior. So as a young woman, if you are told this area is not safe or the city is not safe, that will determine how much right you think you have to use that space. So it's not necessarily even an actual incident of violence happening to you, but the fact that you perceive that place is unsafe, that will. So what do we measure in a safety audit? We measure two kinds of parameters. One is what is physical infrastructure. So is there lighting? Is there a good walk path? Is there public transport around? What is the nature of the built environment? And is there some kind of security? And secondly, we look at what we call the social environment, the social usage of the space. So are there people there? Is it a very male-dominated space? Are there what we call eyes on the street? Eyes on the street is an urban design principle that when you're on the street, you can be seen. So some of you, I think Kanika, you said you're from Gurgaon. There are many parts of the city in Gurgaon where you just walk and there are just high walls on the two sides of you. Now those streets have very poor visibility eyes on the street. Whereas if you walk through some parts of Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, there are shops, there are cafes, there are tea shops, there are street vendors, and all of this adds to what we call natural surveillance. So we don't only measure physical infrastructure, but really the way a space is used. And as a woman and as women, you will relate to that. You know, if you go to a space, even if there are there's good lighting, but if there's nobody there, you will not. And to answer quickly the question that's been asked, yes, one of the parameters is how close is public transport? Can you reach public transport within 2 minutes of walking, within 5 minutes of walking? And that does add to your sense of safety in a space. So we put the data that comes together and we come up with a safety score, which is based on both the crowdsourced data as well as other forms of data collection that we have, which is some amount of image analysis we do through another app called Safetipin Night. But so the data then comes together, and the app has several features that helps women, what we say is helps women navigate the city more safely. So it's not an emergency app. It's not an app. We're not into that, press a button when you're in danger. What we're saying is that, can data help you navigate the streets more safely? Can data allow you to access opportunities in the city better? So the safety audit, the Safetipin app has a feature called the safest route. It has nearby places, it has a tracking feature, and it gives you a safety score. And so what we like is when women give us data, but also use the data to actually make safer decisions in their daily lives. It could be which restaurant to go to, whether to go to a pub at night, where to rent your house if you're moved to a city newly. So the idea is to really take women's voices and bring it back into the public domain. And why I say public domain is, one is that it is available on the app. So I would really encourage all of you to download the app, play with it, use it, give us feedback, but also as in a partnership with the Asia Foundation, the data then gets used, again gets shared with urban stakeholders such as municipal governments, transport departments, police departments. Say, this is the safety score here. This is the reason the safety score is low. It could be because the lighting is poor. It could be other built environment issues. And they have used that to change things. So it's not to just label a place saying this is safe or unsafe. For us at Safetipin, that's not enough, because we want to drive social change. We want to drive urban transformation. And so the app then becomes one of the tools that we use to do that.
Great, thank you. And just on the point of perception, which is very interesting. So one of the questions I think were also posed by members of the community is that the perception of safety varies from woman to woman, and depending on where you're coming from, we're often faced by multiple axes of disadvantages. And we view cities differently, we view urban spaces or rural spaces or towns differently. And so how is Safetipin addressing that? And particularly, I think there was also a question about often gender is also seen in a binary. So how do men see the city versus women? But what about, people from the LGBTQI community and transgenders? How is Safetipin addressing some of those challenges? Because perception varies, and of course, how some of these interventions that you're talking about, just in terms of lighting, street lighting, transportation, access to helplines, etc., also varies, and the type of issues that they face varies. So be nice to reflect on that as well.
Certainly, and you're right. The city is experienced very differently, and depending on your location. So from our data, for example, we do find that young women feel more vulnerable rather than as you get a little older. Another vulnerability is whether you know the city or not. So a migrant also feels more vulnerable in certain spaces because they do not know the space that well. Then, for example, your social class certainly makes a difference. For example, many of the housing societies that we have across the country, we have security guards, but their aim is to protect the property and protect people who live inside. So a domestic worker who works in that same housing society is treated differently than someone like me who lives in that society. So there's also discrimination taking place. And certainly, the intersectionality of different identities comes together to give specific experiences. So what we do in our app is, initially we tried to get a little more of biographical data when people logged in. But as most of you know, we are all more and more reluctant to give any data to technology platforms. So we realized that asking too much data actually puts people off, and they just delete the app actually. So we've really come down to only asking age and gender. So we get a sense of what is the age group. But we do in other projects that we do, I mean, in very concrete projects, we then do FGDs, we do surveys, we do different kinds of data collection to understand people's perspective. So I think certainly we recognize there's a difference in experience, and we do try and build that in. For example, I'll give you an example of one of the communities we worked in Madanpur Khadar, where young women did safety audits, and they pointed out that they actually could not access the tuition classes in the evening because the streets were dark and unsafe, and they faced a lot of sexual harassment. And so they used that data to actually advocate for better lighting, as well as a police picket between 6 and 9 so that they could attend tuition classes. So we also have very specific localized data collection and solutions that we do. We have not had a very specific work with different people of different genders. And I would say that's something we've been wanting to do. So we are really open to a partnership on that to understand how people from the LGBTQI community may view safety, may view the nature of the public space, because for women, very often, especially after dark, the city is a very hostile space. But for some members of the LGBTQI community, all the time it's a hostile space. And I think we need to recognize that. How do we begin to find solutions that are at one level, able to be replicated, because Safetipin is not trying to make only a change in a very small area or community. We truly want our solution to be not just replicable, sustainable, widely used, and this thing. So you do some common denominator things there, and then on the other side, we try and do very specific data collection with certain groups of people, with certain communities in neighborhoods to try and find more customized solutions and inputs.
Great, thank you. And to the point on, replicable solutions that are scalable, sustainable. I think that's also got to do with policy appetite and appetite among stakeholders working in decision-making roles to scale that up as well. So, just on that point, I think, from the point that perhaps SafetyPin was set up, in India and globally, we were going through a phase where we were accepting data and evidence and rigorous evidence and evaluations and action-based research more proactive. I think some decision makers were more had the appetite to accept, the findings from evaluations, etc. And you're working in sort of a tech-focused company that's working on the intersection of data and advocacy and activism. How easy or difficult was having some of those conversations with policymakers to present that data around the safety audits, around just mapping the safety of a city and urban space, and more importantly, for people who are aspiring to work in the policy space, how did you navigate some of those challenges? And what were some of the ways that you ensured that some of that evidence and data, if not actually being used in the way that you would anticipate it, was at least informing some of those decisions?
No, absolutely. And it's, I think, such a central question, for all of us, and certainly for all of you wanting to, who are already maybe working in the policy space, but who want to work in the policy space. Because I think we all realize today that, we've had, 50 years of data, of evidence being generated, and it's really time to scale those interventions, scale change. I don't think we should rest anymore with very small solutions. I think we want full gender transformation to take place in our cities, in our institutions, in our systems. And so therefore, SafetyPin also, from the time we started working, and really I just want to go back a little bit, working in Jagori and with the women's movement, at that time, a lot of the work was really, working with the community at the grassroots and with other women's groups. And with the Safe City agenda, what really appealed to me personally was that I was moving away from speaking to people who thought like me, who accepted, these issues. And it was really beginning to speak to people to convince them that this was an issue. And I decided at that time that I am going to work in this space. I'm not going to speak to people who are already converted, but really take and try and develop a language through which you can convince more and more people to actually accept these ideas. Because if we keep talking only to people who agree with us, how are we going to socialize these ideas in larger spaces? So, having said that, so I worked with the Delhi government even before I joined, even before I started SafetyPin, and very many times, for many years post that also. Now, working in the policy space in India is a very complex negotiation, as many of you might already have experienced. Firstly, it's very person dependent in India. So if you get a good, IS officer sitting across the table, you can actually do a lot. You can really do huge amounts of change, but you have absolutely no idea when he or she is going to get moved. So you're, sort of working on a clock almost, and with a lot of uncertainty. I would say that a lot of the younger, even the bureaucrats, are open to new ideas. Many of them have, studied in institutions like all of you, and have been exposed to new ideas. And we are finding a lot of more women coming into the bureaucracy. So, who themselves have very strong feminist ideas, and they are sometimes driving the agenda in a very male-dominated space still. Policy is still a very male-dominated space. Feminist policy, feminist takes on different policies, not just policies around women, but whether it's foreign policy, whether it's fiscal policy, how do we bring a feminist agenda, to it? And when I say feminist, to me, it's a political agenda. It's not just say, oh, how do we also address the issue of the women or vulnerable groups, which is really a word that I find difficult to accept, because I don't think any of us are vulnerable groups. We've been excluded. We've not been at the table when decisions are being made. And that's the only reason that, I think our voices are not there. So I think the point is more inclusion. than exclusion. Yes, there are certain groups who are vulnerable, who have been marginalized, but looking at the entire set of women as an vulnerable group is something we need to challenge as well, because then you get protectionist policies. Then you get a very protectionist perspective on how to include women. And we are not asking for protection. I think as women, we're asking for rights. Now, when you work with the officials, and whether it's in India or outside, you have to sometimes tone down your feminism, honestly, to be, you have to be strategic, I would say. You have to know your audience. And if you're going to scare your audience before you start, then you have lost the battle right up front. At the same time, I think there are certain things you must never be willing to compromise on, and so if they're not willing to do that, you sometimes have to walk away and say, no, we're not going to do this, because this is just so much below what we're willing to accept, and I think it's a constant negotiation. I think it's super important that women, that feminists, that people of other genders, that people with other identities as well are at the table and are bringing their voices and are bringing a diversity of voices. So I would say women in economics and policy is super important, today, not just policy, but economics, because we know that you can have policies, but if you don't put your money behind the policy, it's a dead policy. It's pointless. They can show it as we've done such a great policy, but and we know this is a big one, that governments write very beautiful policies and then don't put any money behind it, don't put any resources to implement that policy. And that's where it fails. So even advocating for resources and to say that you have a domestic violence policy. For many years, they had all these different provisions, but they had no money to do it. And so therefore it wasn't happening. And then who do you blame? Then you say the policy itself has failed, but the policy has failed for a particular reason. It has failed because there's no political will to actually implement it. And thirdly, I would say today, we're also facing a backlash. Feminism is facing a backlash. Liberalism is facing a backlash. I don't need to talk about how social media plays a role both in advancing our agendas, but also really polarizing our agendas. So today we're at a point where, and I can see the difference, having worked in the sector for more than 30 years, that today we cannot talk across the divide anymore. And that is a problem. It's a big problem. And I don't know, if we cannot speak, how are we going to change the minds of people who think differently? And we have to change their minds. As the feminist agenda is extremely incomplete today, and it cannot be only women and certain people who are wanting to change that agenda. So I think there are many challenges for all of you who are wanting to get into this, but I would say that the time is right, the time is important. There are many women in the system, so you have allies. There are many male allies in the system. So it's not that it cannot be done, but you need patience, and you have to be strategic, and you have to sometimes be willing to step down and accept something that you would have otherwise not accepted, because it's just strategy. And I think that's been something for us at Safetipin. As we go along, I can talk to you about some of the actual examples, but this is more of a general way that even at Safetipin. And just to tell you very quickly, for example, in Delhi, in Delhi, there's such a convoluted architecture of power. There's the municipal corporations, there is the elected city government, and then there's the LG. And many of you who might know Delhi know that it's been a fight among all the different layers of government. But as Safetipin, we have continued to work with all the layers, because we have not aligned ourselves to any one layer to say that we'll only work with this party or this set of people. Because at the end of the day, we want to bring about change in the city. And if we want to bring about change in the city, we have to be willing to work with people who we may not otherwise converse with or be on this thing. So I think that that has helped us, because in Delhi, we've done work on lighting, we've done work on improving access to GBV resources, we've done work on improving last mile connectivity at metro stations, we've worked in low income neighborhoods. We've worked in many other cities. I'm just giving Delhi as an example here. So to say that, it has been possible to actually work with both the elected representative as well as the bureaucracy at different points.
Great. And, I think 2 points that you raised. One, of course, is that we've been pretty much sitting on 50 years of data and evidence. And, almost every few weeks, we have a new study or a survey that's looking at perception of safety. It's looking at interventions to improve women's access to interventions that improve economic opportunities, etc. But to you, where do the data and evidence gaps still lie? Where is it that there's still a paucity of evidence where we aren't really sure what really works to improve, women's safety, whether it's, from a mobility perspective or a gender-based violence perspective. And then sort of the next level, right? So once you improve safety and you reduce barriers, where do women sort of look at in terms of economic opportunities? So in your 30 years, there would be some evidence gaps that would have been addressed, but some still remain. So if you can reflect on that and share for our aspiring economists and public policy researchers here, where do the gaps still lie?
No, absolutely. When I said there's enough evidence of 50 years, what I meant was that there's been enough evidence over the 50 years of gender discrimination that, no policy maker can today say that, oh, this is not true, or, show me the data.
Yeah.
But yes, there is a need for a lot more, I think, nuanced data. There's a need for more robust data, I think not just in forms of impact evaluations. Impact evaluations are needed, but impact evaluations are expensive. Impact evaluations often fail. I've been part of a couple of impact evaluations, they fail simply because, to measure impact, sometimes you need a lot more time. Also, what you're measuring is, I think, important. And we need to measure behavior, but we also need to, I think, get data about how systemic change actually impacts women's lives. So, for example, intimate partner violence. A lot of the economic data is been looked. A lot of the impact data, evaluation data, is looked at. Initiatives. Like say initiatives with men. Does that improve sexual? Does that reduce IPV? And I think that's very important because IPV has to be reduced. But it is still small scale, and we have very few examples, in my view, still where we're able to scale it up at a really large level. So I think we also need data about systemic change. So this particular policy change or the introduction of this particular scheme, how much impact did it have on it can even be an outcome impact. It can even be an output. I think we need to be in this thing. So, for example, and I know this is one thing we have data on, the midday meal schemes. The midday meal schemes has improved girls' access, girls' enrollment in schools, right, in India. So like that, there are many things we still need data in order to push for resources behind it, because I know that has been a big one for states to not be able to remove the resources behind a midday meal scheme, because it reduces child marriage, it keeps girls in schools, it keeps even boys from poorer families in school. So like that, I think there are many important data sets that are needed. In terms of safety, I think one is that what you talked about in your initial question was the nuance. Do different sets of women and different sets of people from other genders need something slightly different? So I think we need a little more sort of stratified data about what is it that is needed. We need data about, I think, for example, we have this public transport, and I think public transport is a big one. Mobility is central to being able to access your rights and opportunities in a city. So what is it about a city? It's the ability to be able to move around, to whether to access education, access work, and access leisure, right? And we need all these towards what we call urban well-being, So we are looking for well-being, and leisure is often not even seen as a valid out valid thing for women to look at. So when we're looking at data, we're looking at, okay, can they access education? Can they access work? That in the work that we've been doing across the country and across many countries, one of the things that girls and women do not have is leisure. They don't have public spaces for leisure. They don't have, you know, they don't, you know, we've met communities, entire, yeah, even young women in communities in big cities who've never been to a theater, you know. So I think the idea that it's something that we take for granted, that we can go out. And I think leisure is important because I think it's time that we say that, you know, women have the right to go out, girls and women, and I'm sorry, I should keep talking about including people of non-binary genders. It's simply because we haven't done enough work, but I do recognize the need for it. I think the right to occupy public spaces, to enjoy it. Because, I mean, there's so much about a city that's also about enjoyment, right? It's not just taking a bus or taking your a Rapido taxi to go to office or to come back late or to, you know, it's also the meeting your friends, going to a park, going to a pub, going to a cafe, walking, sitting on a bench, reading in a park, sleeping in a park. My God, in winter in Delhi, I just envy any park you walk by, there are men enjoying themselves sleeping, and we cannot do that, you know. And I remember many years ago, I think nearly 15 or 20 years ago, someone asked me to write a piece of, and a very simple, she said, what would it be to you? What would really symbolize a safe city? And I said at that time that, you know, to be able to, to be able to lie down in a park and read a book without feeling watched, without feeling judged, without feeling unsafe, you know. So I think there's a lot of different kinds of data. We need qualitative data, we need quantitative data. And actually one point I wanted to say, I think it was your earlier question about convincing, working with policymakers. We found that we do a lot of mapping and we do spatial data we give. And spatial data is very convincing. It's very easy to understand. And we have found that actually has really been one of the best tools to get policymakers to listen, because when they see it spatially and not just in numbers, like this space, this is the problem. And if you do this, this will happen. It gives them a very concrete way of understanding what to do. So I think I jumped from question to question, but I hope that's okay.
Well, that's perfect. That's also for us to also reflect is when was the last time we thought it's okay for us to book a movie ticket at 10 p.m. in the night and go to a movie theater by ourselves, no matter which city we are in. I think very few of us, I know a couple of colleagues who've joined who might have done that, but you think twice before doing anything like that, especially even if you're in the most safest of places and it's say a kilometer away from your house. I think those questions are often not measured, and there's no metric or a hard measure, and sometimes that comes out qualitatively, and it's about convincing and using that qualitative data as well for policy making. I think that's it's pushing that agenda beyond just numbers and data to really looking at, as you said, you know, what does the space look like? Does it mean for us to navigate the city as a person? Which brings me to sort of, so I was looking at the Safetipin website, and from what I understand, you've launched the She Rises framework, and it'd be really nice to talk a bit about that, because that also addresses sort of this whole care agenda, which is gradually gaining traction, at least globally. India, maybe in the next few months as we, you know, embark on G20 conversations. But if you can reflect a bit on that, on what that means from a perspective of reimagining cities from a care-driven agenda or from a care perspective.
Absolutely, that's completely close to my heart. That's my passion today. So really, Safetipin is now 9 years old, and we've just embarked on our 10th year. And one of the things I really wanted to do was to put together our learning and reflections into a framework, into a knowledge document, you know, that guides us as we move forward, but also is available to others. And the She Rises framework comes out of that. She Rises is actually RISES stands for responsive, inclusive, safe, and equitable spaces. And each one of those has, a very deeper understanding of it. And we've put that together. And what we're saying is that what we are looking for today now, as we move forward, is really true gender transformation of our cities, not just small bits of change. For women to truly become equal citizens, we need a deeper gender transformation of our cities. And in that, we have sort of divided the She Rises framework into four broad arenas of change, of social change. One is the public spaces and infrastructure conversation that we have been doing. The second is the mobility and transport. So these are the two broad areas we've been focusing on. But we're saying the two other areas which also need policy and sort of programmatic intervention by the government as well as other urban stakeholders. And one of them is actually on services and amenities. And this would be things like, creches, sort of childcare, education, health. And this is where the prioritizing of the care agenda comes in. And the final one is response to gender-based violence. Because unless we have strong and robust responses to gender-based violence, we know that this will continue to hold women back. And we have really built on the sort of the care economy as well as an ethics of care. Because what we're saying is that, if we only look at inclusion as something that you bring different voices to the table, you are actually ignoring patriarchy. You're depoliticizing the agenda because women are excluded not for any other reason, not for any biological reason, but actually because of patriarchy. So it's a social cultural reason. So unless we prioritize and make visible the work of care, what happens is human beings, men, become the norm, right? And so our cities are then been designed for who? They're designed for able-bodied heterosexual men who have the ability to maybe go to work in the morning, come back in the evening, because somebody is doing all the care work that happens. Now, we all know, and I think COVID really made that very visible, that the care economy and care work is the bulwark of our societies. Everybody is a child at some point. Everybody grows old. Many of us may be disabled at different points of our lives. When you have a fracture, when you're missing, many people, women and men, have to help others, whether it's in a wheelchair, whether it's in a pram. So, it's not, care work is central to life. And it's been invisibilized. It's been invisibilized and it's been done by women and it's been done by poor women and even poor men. And unless we visibilize that, we'll continue to feel that, all of our successes are just our own. That we are some individuated human being who can go out and do things. We can only go out and do things because the care economy is getting taken care of by someone else. And therefore, I think to me, the most radical thing about the She Rises framework is that we're saying that we have to center stage the care economy, but also we have to center stage an ethics of care. An ethics of care says that when you talk about care as defining how you respond to situations, rather than kind of a more, cost benefit economic analysis to all our actions. I'm sorry, I'm not an economist, so I must be saying something wrong. Kanika gave a sweet smile. So I think it's just changing the way that you look at it. And I would urge you all to read Carol Gilligan, who's an anthropologist who wrote maybe 35, 40 years ago on the ethics of care. And she did some super exciting experiments to understand how girls and boys at a very young age respond to situations differently because of this ethics. And I'm sure it's changed now. Girls and boys are brought up, not brought up so differently, at least in certain classes. But it's an interesting thing to understand what does an ethics and economy of care mean. And so therefore, this is going to guide our work as we go forward, but we're also looking to work with other other people to partner, not just with governments, but with other organizations to really develop this, to test this framework, to see how it actually relates to people's lives. And so, I am excited going forward with this She Rises, the sort of campaign, She Rises framework, She Rises. It's also, I do urge all of you to take a look at it. It's also been designed very well because we really wanted to make it a visual treat to use this framework. And being in an organization where most of my team members are architects and urban designers, we tend to work with an aesthetic as well. And I think that was what was the most fun. We have a poster on She Rises, which to us is what we would imagine a feminist city to be, as well as a document, which is a knowledge framework that is building on that.
Excellent. And I've just posted the link to the framework as well in the chat box for everyone. Yes, and I think from a visual perspective also, it was remarkable to see the way that you visualized and broken down the concept of rises. So I think that was also very innovative in sort of unpacking sometimes very complex concepts for a lot of us. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to pause for a bit. I'm going to ask Ayushi if we have any questions that were submitted by members of the community. I know there was one question in the chat box. And I had one question, but if there's time, I'll sort of ask that. Ayushi, is there anything that we?
So I think there was one by Anushka Zafar.
Yeah,
I think this is the one you were talking about as well.
Great. So Anushka asked, Dr. Viswanath, I was wondering about the tracking feature. Is it mainly so that people can share their trip and journey with a trusted contact? And what do users say about the impact on their perceptions of safety when they use this feature? Is it used very commonly?
Yeah, so it is primarily so that people can track their journey so that they can feel safe. And we've been very careful that this feature can only be activated by the person who wants to be tracked. Because we also recognize today there's a lot of stalking that takes place, and a lot of tracking apps are actually stalking apps, and they're advertised with things like, oh, you can put it onto your girlfriend's or your wife or your daughter's phone, and they don't even know. There's no app icon there. And I think that is a problem. So we're trying to keep the control in women's hands. What it tells, it's actually one of the more used features of our app. So people do use it, when they're maybe traveling at night and things like that. What it helps us see is that what are the kinds of situations that women need to use tracking. So is it when they're traveling at night? Is it like after 8 o'clock? Or is it really only after 11 o'clock that you feel you need something like that? Or does that differ from city to city? So maybe in Mumbai, you're happy to go even till 2 o'clock without a tracking app, but maybe in Delhi or some other, Lucknow, you might need a tracking app. So I don't know. I mean, it's we are able to get some data from the tracking in terms of what makes women feel unsafe. Because when you set on the tracking app, that means you're feeling a bit unsafe. So it helps us look at that. And I think there's one more question from Shruti Patil. Thank you. I'm happy to answer that if that's okay.
Sure.
So can you share some exciting things? Yes. So based on the framework, we're doing a whole lot of exciting things, and two of them I'll share. One is we've actually prepared a checklist of about 30 elements and parameters that cities can be measured on. And what we're going to be doing is giving these scorecards to cities on these four, on the responsive, inclusive, safe, and equitable categories, and then helping them to respond to those. So like the safety audit gave recommendations, we're going to give a scorecard with a set of recommendations to cities on which arenas they need to improve. So do they need to improve more on their policies on inclusion? Do they need to improve their public toilets? I always say that public toilets are a feminist issue, because if you don't have public toilets in spaces, women cannot move around freely. I mean, when we did some work on how to get more women to be bus drivers, one of the biggest issues that came in Delhi was that there were no public toilets in bus terminals for women. There were no women's toilets. And this is also a very big issue for trans people. if you don't have toilets, where do you go? So I think, to really get cities to push them, but also we're developing curriculum around the She Rises framework, so that more, whether it's individuals, whether it's urban designers, planners, whether it's social scientists, whether it's NGOs, others, begin to actually use this in their work a little bit more to push the agenda forward around it.
Great. And Dr. Viswanath, this was actually a more of a personal question from my end, which is what I wanted to end the conversation on. And you've said that, 30 years on, when you started off, these movements were live, active, inclusive. It was also a starting point for a lot of us, and for your generation, to enter these spaces and raise issues that were otherwise not recognized. But these movements and spaces have evolved. And now there's also a greater focus, especially in the last few years, on intergenerational dialogues and for young feminists to enter the space. But sometimes they find it perhaps exclusive, and sometimes find it difficult to get a foothold in some of these spaces and conversations. And what advice do you have for young feminists, researchers, women working in this space, to actively engage and raise their voices, but also to bring on issues that are perhaps evolving and new in nature?
Oh, thank you for that question. And I must say that it was a very subtle movement from a point where I felt I was the younger generation challenging older feminists, to suddenly being the older generation and being asked this question from younger feminists. So aging is also sometimes such a flowing process, you don't realize when it's happened. And I remember as a young feminist challenging the older women and older feminists myself. And I think it's important that we're having terms like intergenerational dialogues happening, because I think there is a learning on both sides that is needed. I think especially in cultures like India and South Asia, we have a very ageist culture as well. So there is a sense that, we're also very feudal. So we have a sense that, certain people know more, and that's the way it has to be. But I think many of us also recognizing that the current generation of younger people think very, very differently. And maybe our parents and our seniors also felt that. But for us, and today I do see myself as certainly a different generation. And I think we need to keep the lines of conversation open, and we need to be respectful from both sides. I think we need to be respectful of young people, and young people need to be respectful of of the experience. So I think it's both ways. We need to understand that, your life experiences and your perception of the world is going to give you a different way of looking at it. And secondly, you are the future. So in a sense, it's important. On the other hand, I think young people need to also recognize that, unlike earlier times, today I'm 57, but I probably have another 25, 30 years of good working life. So it's like, we are not over the hill. So we're also still learning ourselves. We're all learners. We're also young. I'm young still compared to an 80-year-old activist who I still find totally inspiring. So I think age is also relative. I think we need to, when we say younger and older, let's recognize it's a gradation, and it's this thing. And finally, I've always said one thing and I think that gives me hope today. I think there was a period in between, especially in the 2000s, when there was not so much social movements, when I didn't find young people actually challenging, but rather accepting, a sort of a more individuated model of personal growth. And I think I've always felt that if young people have some anger at the system, that's a great thing. You guys need to be angry. That's the only way you're going to change the world. So if you're angry at us also, it's good, because I think it's good. You need to be challenging, what has been given to you. So I remember being 25, so I can, identify with it. So I would say that, have the strength, the courage of convictions of what you believe in. Be open to dialogue and recognize that I think all of us have to recognize that we don't know everything. Neither do I know everything, neither do people of my generation know everything, neither do people of your generation. And I think as long as we're open to learning and in a respectful way, I think, and that must be part of the feminist agenda, that, at least we should do that better. I think that would be my final word to all. Let's do it.
Thank you, Dr. Viswanath. That's a wonderful thought to end this conversation on. And thank you for your time and reflecting on your journey. It's been great. I'm going to hand it back to Ayushi for any closing remarks. Over to you, Ayushi.
Why don't we get everyone to put on their video for a minute? Yeah. I'd love to see that one who was here. And do a group picture. Hello, hi Shivam. Hi Anushka, Anjali. Gitika is from my team at Safetipin. So Avantika. Hi everyone, lovely to meet you.
Thank you for joining us on a Friday evening.
Yes. You have sat through 1 hour, so you have earned your glass of wine. You may now do that.
Yeah, but thank you so much, Dr. Viswanath and Kanika, for joining us and for this very, very engaging session. The things you said, Dr. Viswanath, really resonates with me, and I'm sure for a lot of the women who've joined us today. Just cities are to be enjoyed by everybody, and it's such a burden that all of us kind of carry without realizing. So here's hoping for a more inclusive and safe space, and we hope to kind of strive towards achieving that continuously. So thank you so much for reflecting on your journey, and thank you so much, Kanika, for taking out the time to navigate through this conversation. We've really enjoyed having the two of you with us today, and thank you everybody else for joining us on this Friday evening. We do organize more such sessions, so keep an eye out, and happy weekend to everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. Same to you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.